All right, so I did the connection between identity and culture. So a 2015 study done by the University of Phoenix stated that 37% of teens have trouble with their identity. And this led me to think how identity is formed and how it's developed. And I realized that oftentimes cultural values tend to reflect identity values. And that led me to my question of, does culture play a role in our personal identity? So, University of Texas professor Deborah Paredes states that Selena was someone who never lost touch with her roots. And this is what helped her become successful because her culture was showing her identity, which reflected her art, which was both like fashion and music. And this made her seem more authentic to her fans, and they were able to connect to her art that she was producing because she embraced her culture within her identity. The stimulus material that I used was, for one, the Selenidad and Latinidad article by Deborah Paredes, in which there's a quote that says how acts of cultural memory and collective mourning can generate and transform concepts of national, racial, and gendered identities. And this basically explains that beliefs and values are key factors in the development of identity. And then I also used the Maori oral narratives by Judith Binet. And there's a quote in there that says, we are what we remember, and society is what we remember. And society is developed by a culture, and it also creates a culture. So thus, her quote is basically saying that our identities are created from the culture that is created through our society. My thesis is, due to culture playing a vital role in determining values in one's educational experience, people tend to form their personal identity around culture in order to strive for a sense of belonging within their community. My points that I have to support my thesis are, first of all, educational experience, which is basically the culture that's developed within learning environments. And then also cultural values, and then the desire to fit in. And all three of my points are supported by perspectives such as adolescents, people of different cultures, along with teachers. The first point that I'll be talking about is educational experience, which is the culture that is developed within learning environments. So Dale Sheehan from Otago Medical School explains that when there's a learning environment, it, along with culture, impacts identity. And oftentimes this is due to culture established within learning environments. We spend most of our day in school, and we all have different classes, which all have different cultures. And that's what helps make all of us have our own unique individual identities, is because we're constantly surrounded by different cultures that help develop and create who we are. Sheehan also explains with this quote that basically explains that teachers are aware of classroom culture and its impacts on adolescent minds. And this is why sometimes when you enter a new class, teachers ask for like norms or class rules, and that's to help establish a classroom culture. And they're aware that like the classroom culture has a great impact on our adolescent minds. The next point that I'll be talking about are cultural values. So Dinesh Bugara from the Institute of Psychiatry in London highlights that culture is created by many different factors, and one of these big factors are values. And oftentimes our cultural values are similar to our own personal values, and oftentimes core values are really hard to like change, so they really establish who we are. And an example of this is the Sami people. And so in Ursula Haynes, an associate professor of English at Stanford, she quotes in a study, and her quote is, "The meanings and identities that the Sami people derive from herding reindeer cannot be shifted to a different species or place without altering those meanings." And this is because core cultural values are really important, and they reflect the people as a whole. And these people all have identities that are created from these core values, and they can't easily be changed or influenced. The last point that I'll be talking about is the desire to fit in. So, Ugar from the Psychiatry in London explains a process known as acculturation, which is essentially the process in which culturally divergent groups connect and their values, beliefs, and customs become shared, or sometimes one culture will fully engulf another. And so oftentimes people will match their culture to their surrounding cultures in order to fit in with their community. And so they'll find ways to share values with their surrounding culture in order to create a sense of familiarity. However, it is important to note that acculturation does not necessarily change identity for everyone, and that it mostly affects younger people and adolescents because they're still discovering who they are and their own personal identities. And so acculturation doesn't necessarily impact everyone, but it has a huge effect on younger people just because they are oftentimes searching for a way to fit in with their surrounding community, and they want to be able to connect to their peers. So my conclusion, if you're struggling with understanding your identity, you should reflect on your own culture. However, some limitations with this is that culture isn't necessarily the only factor that impacts identity, and that there's loads of other things. For example, nature versus nurture has a huge impact on identity. And then also, if you're unable to connect with your surrounding cultures, then it's going to be really hard to be able to understand your identity better through those cultures. However, if you do decide to look for your culture or look for your identity within your culture, you can oftentimes ask your peers, whether that's family, classmates, or anyone with similar culture, what their values are, and you can see if those values reflect yours. And that's my
What information were you looking for that you were unable to find or locate, and how did you go about trying to find that information?
I was definitely looking for very specific examples of people who experienced their culture impacting their identity, which is why I put in the Sami people example. However, I did want to find more examples, and so to go about that, I would search up different cultures and see if I could find articles that would have information relating to how their values reflect their people's values.
And what additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these questions important?
Some additional questions that emerged from my research, well, one of them was the age group that's mostly impacted by culture and identity, which I then found was definitely younger people, because they're still kind of developing into their own people. And so that was a big question for me, was just who's most impacted by culture when it comes to identity.